as we continue on in our service and get ready for the sermon, we are it just seems like we're well into our way into summer, even though the first official day of summer is just a few days ahead still. It always seems like it comes a lot sooner than that, especially this year. Most years, the beginning of June is pretty hot, and this year it's not really been much of an exception to that. But as we get into summer, I think it's time for us to start our summer sermon series in which we're going to be going through the book of Exodus. And as we look at the book of Exodus, first of all, if you have real good memory, and I'll just be impressed if you remember this, so don't feel bad if you don't. But last summer, we went through most of the book of Genesis, starting with chapter 12, starting with Abraham. And so we went through most of Genesis last summer, and then most recently we went through chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis, which, generally there are two main parts to Genesis, the first 11 chapters and then the chapters 12 through 50. And so just to catch you up on where we're at, 2 weeks ago we talked about the Tower of Babel, and that was in Genesis 11. And then after that, in chapter 12, we are introduced to Abraham, and God has a covenant with Abraham that he is going to bless the world through his descendants. And so in Genesis, we follow the stories of Abraham, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob. And then Jacob's sons, Joseph, and all of his brothers, who form the 12 tribes of Israel much later. But in the Joseph story, Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. But he works his way up and he becomes the second in command, which is really fortunate because a famine hits. And when the famine hits, his brothers travel to Egypt to get supplies to survive the famine. And they have no idea that they're going to ever see Joseph again, and let alone that he's going to be in charge of their rations. And so this is a wonderful story of reconciliation and forgiveness as Joseph reconciles with his brothers. Not only that, but ultimately he has his entire family move to the region of Egypt so that they can be cared for during the famine. It sounds like a great story. It's kind of like a happily ever after story until you get to the sequel, Exodus. Exodus starts off quite a bit later, 400 plus years later, and in Exodus 1 we are entering into a very dark time for the Hebrew people. It's nothing new for them, as it says that a Pharaoh came who knew nothing about Joseph. Time flies and people forget. And so a Pharaoh came who knew nothing of Joseph and this story of the Hebrew people. And he just saw these Hebrews, who were not Egyptians, as a possible threat. And so he enslaved them. And they continued to grow in number through the years. And so not only did he enslave them, but he came up with a policy of population control. So this slavery went on for 400 years. To give you an idea of perspective, that is about twice the length of the history of the United States of America. So that's a long time. Nobody would have probably remembered in that age where documents were not kept as prolifically as they are now. Most people would have no memory of anything that happened before they were in slavery. And so they are in slavery for generations and generations, and then a Pharaoh decides that they're becoming too numerous, and so he is going to enact this policy of population control where Hebrew baby boys are to be killed. This is a policy that is barbaric, and yet it is something that has been done in one form or another throughout much of human history and still in some forms today. It is a kind of policy that only a man could come up with, because, not to bash men or to say that women are perfect, but generally it seems like, if we ever did an experiment and we said, what would the world be like if women were in charge? You have to wonder if it'd be less violent. But anyway, he has this policy where all baby boys are going to be killed amongst the Hebrews. And his one mistake, though, with this policy is who he put in charge of it. And he put the midwives in charge of this, which makes sense. In one way that makes sense because the midwives, the Egyptian midwives, they are there to help the Hebrew women give birth. And so they are there at the moment of birth. It makes sense that they are there, that they just kill the babies when they see that they are boys. However, Pharaoh picked the wrong people to kill babies. These women, these midwives, were compassionate and courageous, and they refused to do it. They didn't tell Pharaoh, we're not going to do this. They just didn't do it. And so we will see here in this story that in the midst of ugliness, unlikely heroes arise. We see that that's true then, it's also true now. So in this story, the midwives, they refused to do this, and this is a great risk because they could be in big trouble if it was found out that they were defying the order of the Pharaoh. And indeed, the Pharaoh brings them to account and says, what's going on here? And so they make up a story and they say, well, these Hebrew women, they give birth by the time we get there. We don't even have a chance to really do anything because they're already given birth by the time we get there. And we're not told really if he buys it or not. But these women are seen as our first heroes in the story because they are willing to defy the order of the Pharaoh in order to save vulnerable lives and to continue the rescue operation. All the midwives, we don't know how many midwives were involved in this. It was just 2 that were brought forward. They were kind of like supervisors. So the question obviously that we want to ask is, was it wrong for them to make up a story so they could continue in their operation? And it's kind of like asking if it was wrong for people who hid Jews during the time of World War II, was it wrong for them to lie and tell the authorities that they didn't have anybody hidden in their house? Extreme situations like that sometimes call for unconventional answers. And for the midwives, they wanted to be able to continue their operation of saving these children. And they knew that that would not be able to continue if they were found out. And so we don't want to necessarily place judgment on them in an extreme situation like that. Sometimes the only choice for them, and true for them during World War II, during extreme situations like that where lives are on the line, sometimes the only option is to choose the lesser of 2 evils. So these women are seen as being virtuous for doing the right thing. But the Pharaoh responds by changing his policy to where anybody who finds a Hebrew boy can kill him. So now it's not just the midwives, it's anyone. And this is the kind of ugly situation that they find themselves in when Moses' mother gives birth. And so she gives birth to Moses, and she hides him for 3 months, no doubt with the help of a midwife or a servant. But after so long, it's not possible to do that forever. That's kind of like a temporary solution, maybe while she's thinking about what she's going to do. And so she makes this little boat. We think of it as a basket, but it's a little mini boat. And she makes it out of the same material as Egyptian riverboats are made out of. She covers it in tar, which is a waterproof substance that they used in Egyptian riverboats. So she knew what she was doing. This was not as reckless of an act as we sometimes think that it is. It's not as though she just placed this basket in the middle of a river and said, well, I hope that something good happens. It wasn't quite that reckless, even though it's still risky. But it says that they placed this little mini boat in the reeds along the banks of the Nile. Well, some of these reeds can grow up to 16 feet high. So they would not only somewhat shelter the child from the weather and such, but also this is going to keep this mini boat from going out into the river. It's going to stay amongst the banks. Not only that, but Moses' older sister Miriam follows to see what happens. So it's not that they're just abandoning this child. And so she follows along to see what happens. Now the second part is interesting because whether we want to call it God's providence or whether this was pre-planned, Pharaoh's daughter is out bathing when she discovers this little mini boat. Now the question is, did Miriam and Moses' mother know that this basket, this boat, would go to the Pharaoh's daughter? We don't know. But that's an interesting thing to think about. Perhaps there was much more planning into this than we think. Because you would think they would know where the Pharaoh's family is. But anyway, in any case, the Pharaoh's daughter finds this child. No doubt she would recognize the physical features of Hebrew. There would have been no secret that this was one of the babies that her father would want executed. And yet she also defies him and says, I'm going to raise this child as my own. Interesting family dynamics there. And so Miriam, the sister, Moses' sister, who's been watching this whole time, asks the Pharaoh's daughter if she would like her to get a Hebrew woman to help nurse the child for her. Now, we don't know if the Pharaoh's daughter had seen Miriam before this point, or if she was in hiding and then comes out. If she was in hiding and then comes out, this would be a very risky thing to do. But they agree, and so Miriam is able to reunite Moses with his mother for a time while his mother was able to nurse him for the Pharaoh's daughter. Isn't this interesting? You know, we have in this story right away 4 women who are heroes, unlikely heroes who rise up in the midst of ugliness. We have Moses' mother, sister, the midwife, you know, her particular midwife who would not kill the child. And then we have Pharaoh's daughter and her attendants as well, which they probably really just go along with whatever. But nonetheless, all these people are kind of working together in a way to go against the Pharaoh. And so we see these heroes. And let me tell you, did they think that by doing this they were going to overturn a 400-plus year institution of slavery of the Hebrew people? Did they think that the chain reaction of this would result in their freedom? No way. You know, there's no way. Remember, 400 years, there's no memory of anything else but slavery. There's probably no way that they would have even imagined freedom. And yet, here they were, simply doing the right thing with what was in front of them. They were not concerned with ending slavery. They just wanted a baby boy to live so that he could live his life. Well, we continue the story. We fast forward. Moses grows up in the Egyptian household. He's a part of 2 worlds, really. And he goes out and he sees this slave master beating a slave. And so he looks this way and that, and he knows that nobody is watching. And so he kills this slave master. But it turns out that this was not as secret as he had thought it would be. People knew, and word got out. And so he knew that if he wasn't going to be killed, he was going to have to run away. And so Moses runs away off into the wilderness towards Midian, which is where he will spend the next large portion of his life. And we'll get into that subject next week. But this raises another interesting question. Was Moses a murderer or a hero? Well, it probably depends on who you ask. If you ask the slave might say that Moses was a hero. We don't know all the details of the story, but it could be that this slave had been beaten before, was malnourished, was weak, did not have much in the way of resources in his body, and it may have been that this beating would have been his last. And so this slave may have considered Moses to be a hero. However, if you ask the Egyptians who are administering this institution of slavery, they would say that Moses was a murderer and a traitor. What if you ask Moses? Well, it's really presumptuous of us to assume an answer of somebody who lived thousands of years ago. But I wonder if he might answer something of both. You know, that, he did what he thought he had to do in the moment. Again, we don't know all the details. Could it be that he saw this beating, and perhaps there were many scenarios before, numerous times when slaves were beaten by their masters and then they gave out and they died. Perhaps this was another one of many familiar scenarios, and he decided that he was going to try to stop this master from killing the slave, maybe by incapacitating him or something, but then when they got into the fight, things got out of hand, and it resulted in his death. We don't know for sure. And that's the key, is that we don't know all the details, and so we don't necessarily want to place full judgment on Moses for what he did because we weren't there. We also know that for most of us, not all of us, but for most of us, we have never been a part of an oppressed people group. I have never been a part of an oppressed people group. I belong to the dominant race in America. And so I have no idea what it is to live as an oppressed person. I don't know what it is to feel powerless or unheard, or to feel as though my concerns and my problems are not real. I don't know what that's like. But sometimes in those situations in Moses' day, maybe he thought he was, we don't know if he thought, I'm going to kill this guy, or if he thought, I'm going to incapacitate him. We don't know. But what we do know is that he did what he thought he had to do, and whether or not it was right or not is something that is difficult to answer. We do know that murder is wrong, right? The Bible is clear on that. Murder is wrong. And Jesus teaches us to love our enemies, which is different than killing them and burying them. And so we don't want to, Jesus is definitely not a proponent of violence or murder. And yet at the same time we have to ask, is there ever a situation where self-defense is warranted, where self-defense is okay? And is there ever a time when violence is unfortunately necessary? These are questions that people go round and round and round on. There are no easy answers to these questions. And sometimes when we have never been in a situation like that, it's easy for us to pronounce judgment on somebody who has, and they made a certain decision, whether they decided to engage in self-defense or not. But we want to hold that intention and say that yes, we want to value human life, and murder is wrong. But we don't know the whole situation that Moses was in. What I would say is that Moses was younger, and after he flees from there, this is going to be one of the best things that happens in his life, because when he is living in Midian, he spends a lot of time in a much different lifestyle. He grows, he matures, he becomes more wise, and ultimately he will encounter God in the burning bush. And so probably to answer the question, was Moses a murderer or a hero? We would say yes. He was both. And we see that in many biblical stories, morality is a complicated thing, and we see that our biblical heroes are not as innocent as what they may sometimes seem to be. And the stories are messy, and there are no clear trajectories that our biblical heroes track where they're either all good or all bad. They are a mixture of everything. As we look at stories like King David and many others that we consider biblical heroes, and yet we know that they also did some pretty terrible things. We know that most people, and let's just say all people, are a mixture of good and bad. And yet we continue, hopefully, on the trajectory towards Christ-likeness. So as we see in this story, it's a very ugly story. We see that unlikely heroes emerge in the ugliness, and we see that today too. There's been a lot of ugliness this year, no doubt. We have the ugliness of systematic racism, police brutality, violent protests. We have people getting hurt. We have a lot of ugliness in this year, and yet in the midst of that, we see unlikely heroes emerging. We see people who are working towards peace and reconciliation and listening to one another. We see people who are protesting peacefully. We see people who are working to enact change in nonviolent ways. We see police officers who are refusing to hate people who are from a minority race and instead are trying to work towards reconciliation to protect the public, including everyone, and sometimes standing in solidarity with those who are protesting. We see people who are willing to work towards reconciliation. We see in the midst of the pandemic, we see people who are, whether they are choosing to or whether they have to because they are essential workers, people who are working to keep the world going. We see in the midst of this people who are sewing masks and wearing masks to protect other people. We see wealthy individuals around the world who are donating large amounts of money to help with research in the development of a vaccine. We see heroes emerge in many ways in the midst of the ugliness, and that helps. I've heard it said before, when you see bad news on TV, look for the helpers, right? Because there you will see God. You will find God. And in this story of the Bible that we are in, the story of Moses' beginnings, this ugly story, we see the helpers. We see people who are working for and seeking to do what is right, even as they themselves struggle with the best way to do that. And maybe sometimes their methods are questionable, and we might raise our eyebrows at some of the ways they do it. Nonetheless, we cannot but acknowledge that they are seeking, trying to save lives and to accomplish the greater good in the midst of what they're doing. We can do the same thing. Whatever is going on in our lives, and with everything that we are going through, we can seek to be Christ-like. We can seek to bless others and to change the world. Now, when we think about changing the world, so often we think of big issues like, obviously, racism, war, hunger, disease, all these big issues that we think about when we think about changing the world. And oftentimes we can become overwhelmed and we can think, well, what can I do to change these things? Or what can a group of people do to change these things? The problem seems so large that sometimes we become overwhelmed and we feel helpless. But you're not as helpless as you think. You are probably only about as helpless as Miriam, Moses' sister, or his mother. You're probably about as helpless as the midwives. As we think about these people, again, did they think, gee, I'm going to try to undo slavery? Did they think to themselves, gee, I wonder if we can somehow find a way to set our people free even though we haven't been for 400 years? I don't think so. No. They couldn't imagine that. They just did what was right with what was in front of them. They saved a child that they could not see killed. And some of them lived to see the ripple effect, the cause and effect chain reaction that took place as a result of them doing the right thing with what was in front of them. Some of them lived to see it. Miriam, his sister, lived to see their people go free. Moses' mother, probably not. She's not mentioned again after this. So she probably did not live to see that. And that's a good principle for us to remember as we live our lives. We can make a difference in the world by simply doing the right thing with whatever is in front of us, with whatever we have. And so we may not see the ripple effect of what is that chain reaction that comes as a result of the good deeds that we do. We may or may not see that in our lifetime. But that's okay, because seeing the result, seeing the big change that may happen as a chain reaction of what you have done should not be the motivation for doing it. But we should do it because we want to help. And so some of us, we will never see that. We will never see the chain reaction. But by doing the right thing with what is in front of us, yes, we can help with these issues of hunger, with war, with racism, with disease, with any of these things. We have a part to play. We have a small part to play maybe, but we have a part to play. And those ripples grow as they spread and as they continue on through that chain reaction that maybe you started or maybe you continued. And so just as Miriam and Moses' mother, whom tradition says her name is Amram, so Miriam, Amram, the midwives, and Pharaoh's daughter, her attendants, Moses in his young, maybe less wise years, all these people had a small part to play in what would come to be a change, a huge change that would result ultimately in the blessing of the entire world. And so may we know that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. We are not just ourselves, and the things that you do to help other people, those seemingly small and insignificant things, are not so small and insignificant after all. You know, have you ever tried, most of us have probably put a puzzle together before, and usually you start with the edge pieces. Then when you get the edge pieces completed, you start with the picture itself. Now, if you're like a lot of people, you start with the picture that's easier. You know, you can see the different pieces. But, you know, we usually do the background last, the part that's just one color, you know, that's really hard. I remember seeing not too long ago, Heinz Ketchup came out with a puzzle, and it was all just red. It was all just, there's nothing there, it's just all red. Can you imagine? Can you imagine getting that and trying to put that together? It'd be so hard. You know, we leave that background part to last. Those are what we would consider the insignificant pieces. You know, they don't seem to have much of an effect on the picture itself. And yet, even those small, seemingly insignificant pieces that, well, we would say on its own, we look at it, oh, this is just a black puzzle piece, or oh, this is just a red puzzle piece. We would think, well, this doesn't have much to contribute to the big picture. And yet it does. Because if that piece is missing, you're definitely going to know it, right? And your puzzle is not completed. And in the same way, you might think that your life and your actions and the things you're doing to help other people, it might seem so small and insignificant to you. But the ripple effect of that is so much larger than you may ever realize. And it might not result in something like the end of a 400-plus year of slavery. But it might result in changes to people's lives that go on and on much further than you ever thought imaginable. And so I want to encourage you to continue on, doing the right thing with what is in front of you right now, knowing that God can work through that to change the world in small ways that can lead to very significant changes.